Good evening and welcome to our online book launch event for Jonathan Geltner's debut novel, Absolute Music, recently published by Slant Books. I look forward to introducing Jonathan in a few minutes, but first, just a couple of brief orders of business. My name is Gregory Wolfe, and I am Slant's publisher and editor. Slant is an independent, award-winning, not-for-profit literary press, specializing in fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction, drama, young adult books, theology, and philosophy, the genres that have traditionally constituted the strand of literature known as belles lettres. Veteran book reviewer John Wilson recently wrote, "The best kept secret in American publishing today is Slant Books. Slant's list is incorrigibly eclectic in the best sense of the word. The books Slant publishes don't represent any school, any clique, any fashionable or unfashionable trend. Fiction, poetry, memoir, and more, they are incorrigibly individual, even as they are rooted in tradition." Here's another message we received a little while back. Congratulations on your launch as an indie press. What you have conceived and achieved strikes a deep chord within. Your vision for Slant, promoting first-rate literary craft and enduring humanistic values, resonates with the best of my family's publishing tradition. You should get an award for classic book design, from cover art to typeface, lay out the works. These are volumes and treasures to behold and hold. Those words came from Charles Scribner III. Of course, we're hoping that you and all those you love will conspire to take Slant out of that best kept secret status as soon as possible. Now, on to tonight's business. We're thrilled to be present this evening at a literary debut, an occasion which, as far as I am concerned, is the equivalent for a writer of baptism, first communion, and confirmation, if not confession. So by way of introduction, Jonathan Geltner was born in Eastern Massachusetts, but grew up mainly in Cincinnati, Ohio. He studied English, classics, and French at the University of Cincinnati, pursued graduate work in English at the University of Chicago, and earned an MFA in fiction from Warren Wilson College. He published a translation of Paul Claudel's 5 Great Odes with Angelico Press in 2020. Absolute Music is his first novel. His present work is a quest for re-enchantment through the study of a variety of authors and places. Jonathan is an avid cyclist and student of Tai Chi, as well as an amateur philologist with a penchant for Irish, Hawaiian, Hebrew, and classical Chinese. He lives in southeastern Michigan with his wife and 2 sons. We'll begin with Jonathan doing a reading from the book, a couple different passages, I believe, interspersed with some of his own commentary and narrative. And while he is reading, I would encourage anyone to ask questions by typing them directly into the chat box. Depending on the variety of factors, including time, I will pass some of these questions on to Jonathan after he's finished his reading and possibly ask 1 or 2 myself. But now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Geltner.
Greetings and thanks to all who have showed up tonight. I was going to say come out this evening, but then realized we haven't gone out. Thank you for showing up. It's wonderful to see familiar names and unfamiliar. I also want to especially thank you, Greg, and Slant Books for publishing this novel, Absolute Music. It is a very literary novel, to use that term in a purely descriptive sense, and it is downright hard to publish such things these days, and especially if it's a first novel, a debut novel. So I feel extremely lucky, privileged to be here reading tonight. I hope you'll enjoy. I'm gonna kind of launch into, I'm going to read from two movements in this novel, Absolute Music. And I think I'll say something after I read the first one about why I just called it a movement. I'll just give you the minimum sort of background that you would need to understand the first part that I'm going to read here. And then, like I say, maybe I'll fill in a little bit after this first movement, and then maybe we could have some questions then, and then I'll do another part of the book. It's a first-person novel. This whole thing is narrated by a fantasist, a guy who writes fantasy or tries to write fantasy, named MacPhail. At least that's the only name that he gives himself in the text. It's a family name of his. There is a plot in this literary novel, I swear, I promise. I'm not going to read from much that has to do with that this evening, so as not to give anything away. But a lot of the book, because it is a very literary type thing, very sort of philosophical, digressive, kind of speculative piece of fiction, has to do with, it really consists of MacPhail remembering stuff from earlier in his life. So this first part that I want to read from is from the second suite of the novel. Again, I'll explain why it has that terminology later on, fairly early on in the thing. And it has to do with Cincinnati, which is one of the most important places in the novel. And MacPhail is remembering, he's remembering a time in his youth when he was, I guess, about 19 or 20 years old. And he has just told his fiancée of that time, the woman who would become his first wife, Severine, that he's going to quit music. He's a music composition student, and Severine is a musician as well. And he's just told her he's completely changing up his life. He's told her this in a neighborhood of Cincinnati called Mount Adams. They've gone there. They've gotten into a bar and drunk some wine in the middle of the day, underage. And they're wandering around in this neighborhood. Up at the top of that neighborhood is a beautiful Catholic church called the Immaculata. And they've wandered past that. It's the church where they're going to get married. And then they've wandered downhill a little bit into an area called Eden Park and made their way over to a very peculiar statue, which you're about to hear about, that's in Cincinnati. And it is by this statue, this little statue, it's still elevated up above the river, the Ohio River there, that MacPhail, being the weirdo that he is, has decided to tell his fiancée that he's quitting his career, basically, such as it is in his youth. So that's the most of what you need to know. The only other thing I'll mention is that one of the memories, that the most sort of catalyst-like memory in this gets this whole novel going, is MacPhail remembering the death at the age of 14, when he was also 14, of a girl named Hannah. She'll be mentioned just briefly in this one movement. Other than that, there's not much to say. He has a best friend named Gregory, and he had a kind of weird vision of Cincinnati with Gregory at sort of the portico of the Immaculata Church when he was just a small boy. But I think that's it. So this is a Cincinnati part of the novel. And MacPhail has decided to remember the story occasioned by the statue, next to which he told his fiancée he's quitting music. This is how he tells the story. And he's gonna, as you'll see, get pretty far afield from his initial topic. In the days when Homer's stories, already old, first took the shape we know, On the other side of the Mediterranean, another story was beginning. Numitor was king in Alba Longa, but he was deposed by Amulius, Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, a priestess of the goddess Vesta, and as such vowed to celibacy, was seduced or raped by Mars, and the fruit of that illicit union were the twins Romulus and Remus. Amulius, the usurper, was perturbed by the appearance of heirs to his still living rival's line, and he had a servant take the twins away from the city and slaughter them. It would have brought down divine wrath to do it in the city itself. But at the last moment, this servant was overcome with pity or cowardice, or sheer laziness, according to Livy. And so instead of murdering the infants outright, he abandoned them in a basket on the Tiber. The river deposited them gently on the shore in the shadow of the 7 hills that would one day cradle the eternal city, and they were suckled by a she-wolf. The wolf never had any name but Lupa, which means a female wolf, and was slang in antiquity for a prostitute. The Romans, like the Hebrews of the same period, and the Christians who would inherit the sensibilities of both peoples, understood their relationship to the divine as primordially involved with adultery. When Romulus and Remus outgrew the care of the wolf, they were raised to manhood by a shepherd. Thereupon the twins became involved in a struggle to reinstate their grandfather Numitor on the throne in Alba Longa. It was only in the course of that struggle that the twins learned of their ancestry. Upon its successful conclusion, the royal youth set out to found their own city, and they happened to choose for its location the 7 hills where the wolf first discovered them. Discord ensued, however, for the men could not agree on which of the 7 hills to build their city. They resorted to augury to make the decision, but the augury was ambiguous, and they fell to argument, then to outright combat, in the course of which Romulus murdered his brother. Again, and passing over the baby in a basket motif, we see a parallel with the stories of the Hebrews, for in them civilization begins with Cain's murder of his brother Abel and his subsequent accursed wandering. It is Cain who founds the first cities. The sculpture of the wolf was known to have existed anciently in Rome. The one situated in Eden Park, where I told Severine that I had decided to renounce music, is a replica of one that dates to the 11th or early 12th century. She is beautiful and haunting, this Lupa, neither meager nor voluptuous. Her head is turned to the side and her jaws parted slightly. She is tired, but also joyous and eager, the same expression that every new mother I have seen has worn. In the story, she is able to nurse the infants because she had recently lost cubs of her own, and I think there is sadness in this wolf's eyes, along with the surprise of finding herself a mother after all. But why should the sons of Italy, in conjunction with Mussolini himself, have gifted Cincinnati this sculpture? European settlement of Southwest Ohio began in the late 1780s and soon centered on the large semicircular basin to be found at the confluence of the Ohio River and Mill Creek, coming from the north, and opposite Mill Creek, the Licking River, coming from the south. The first name for the city was Losantiville, a portmanteau meaning city opposite the mouth of the Licking River. The L for licking, os meaning mouth in Latin, anti opposite in Greek, and ville the French for city. But a number of the first European settlers were veteran officers of the Revolutionary War and soon decided to rename the place after the Society of the Cincinnati, of which they were members. They had taken the name for their society from an archaic Roman figure almost as legendary as Romulus and Remus, one Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. Cincinnati is the plural of his cognomen, which means curly-haired, and is thus perceptibly related in the Indo-European root to our word kink, as for example, a kink in the river, for among the early Romans, a C always sounded like a K, cincinatus. The veterans put themselves under the aegis of the legendary Roman because his story is one of humility, renunciation, and careful labor upon the earth, themes as central to the early Roman mythology as to Jefferson's ideal of an agrarian republic. But shadowing Cincinnati's story of humility, renunciation, and the strength of self-restraint is another tale, one of violence, scandal, fear, and failure. Lucius's son Caeso committed an act of insurrection, which, though it failed, involved murder, earning him a death sentence. Lucius expended the bulk of his old Etruscan wealth in buying his son's life, though Caeso still had to go into exile in neighboring Etruria. Lucius retreated to the modest remainder of his estate on the hills opposite Rome, perhaps roughly where the Vatican is today. Soon after this disgrace, however, the senators came to Cincinnatus on his farm, bearing his old senatorial toga and begging for his aid in defending the city against the invading Volsci. This was only 2 generations or so after the last of the Roman kings was overthrown, an event Lucius Quinctius would have remembered from his boyhood. The republican order that had replaced the monarchy was still nascent and now in danger of premature death. The senators made Lucius dictator, a position of supreme and emergency authority, and in that capacity he defeated Rome's enemies. Rather than remain in power, as he easily could have done, once the threat had passed, Lucius Quinctius surrendered the fasces, the rods bundled about an axe, which symbolized absolute power. He returned to his farm. This story repeated itself 2 decades later, and despite his by then very advanced age, Lucius again saved Rome, and a second time gave up the fasces the moment he was able to do so. At Sawyer Point on the river in downtown Cincinnati, and almost visible from the Immaculata atop Mount Adams, there is a large bronze statue of Cincinnatus, one hand on the plow at his side, the other arm extended, holding the fasces, remanding power to the Senate and people of Rome. So why should Cincinnati keep, in an out-of-the-way corner of one of her hilltop parks, the sculpture of the fictional Capitoline Wolfe, especially considering that it was a gift from Mussolini, whose fascism stood in starkest contrast to the values epitomized by Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus? The city where Hannah was born and died was named for a man, not for another place, but in taking its name from Lucius Quinctius, Cincinnati became associated with his city, particularly as it was asserted that Cincinnati was built, like Rome, on 7 hills. Over time, the idea of a city of 7 hills, despite its association with the beast in Revelation, took on an auspicious aura, though no Cincinnatian could tell you why it matters that a city should claim to be built on 7 hills, as many cities do, including Athens, Jerusalem, Moscow, and dozens of others. Just as no 2 Cincinnatians will give you 7 identical names for the foundational hills. This is because the city was not founded on 7 hills, but in the central basin between Mill Creek and the Ohio. She was, to begin with, not a city set upon a hill, but a river city, cradled by the hills into which she would later leap. It is the river that imparted to Cincinnati, as Harry Graff wrote in the 1943 WPA Guide to Cincinnati, a lustiness which still lingers. There is no understanding the person I was in that springtime, and the person Severine was, without understanding the place where we lived and loved each other. I knew it intuitively then, and have always believed it since. We are creatures of place. Severine and I may always, Severine and I may not have been born in Cincinnati, like Hannah and Gregory, but we were nonetheless an expression of the city of 7 hills. Somehow our hometown's namesake is part of us, and our story and all the mythical association he brings with him. But also the very shape of the place is involved with us, or we are involved in it. The hills of Cincinnati are actually punctuated and carven tablelands. It is called dendritic terrain, after the Greek word for tree, and indeed the gouges made by water running to the Ohio make a pattern like the branching of a tree. If I had to name 7 distinct cradle hills surrounding the wide and often miasmic Mill Creek Valley where it flows into the Ohio, haven of pork packers and iron foundries, soap and bourbon makers, rail yards, and interstate highway, I would say that from the west arcing round north and back down on the east, there are Mount Echo, Price Hill, Fairmount, Fairview, Bellevue, Mount Auburn, Mount Adams. That's 4 mounts, 2 views, and a hill. Throughout the rest of the city's 52 neighborhoods and uncounted suburbs, there are at least a dozen more places that include hill or some version of mount in their name. One always has a sense of being either up or down, and even the topland is not flat. Of those 7 cradle hills, 5 are crowned with large parks. The hills make a ring of colorful palisades. From the center of the city, look to any horizon, including mirroring formations in Kentucky, and you see green in summertime, or purple shadowy, or golden gleaming brown and gray, bare deciduous trees in winter. The hills are spotted with houses and girdled with streets that run at steep angles. There are also public stairways. Once there were funicular inclines, vineyards upon the cradle hills, and long cellars tunneled into them for the purpose of lagering beer. The uneven landscape of Cincinnati divides the neighborhoods and suburbs sharply from each other, giving the city a parochial and cliquish character, and the hills cut her off from the rest of the state of Ohio. Cincinnatians are not really Ohioans. They belong to the river and the hills that define their lives. A strongly felt disparity divides east and west in the city of Seven Hills, one side or the other of Mill Creek. But these halves are themselves composed of isolated pockets. It is ultimately topography that brings some Cincinnatians close and alienates others from their kindred spirits if they happen to live a hill or a valley too far. And yet the city's compartmentalized nature also makes it a palimpsest or manifold, endowing it with mystery and amplitude, as if it were somehow larger than it is. 7 bridges connect the center of the Seven Hills to Kentucky. In the early stage of the city's growth, an arm of the Miami and Erie Canal flowed through the center of Cincinnati under what is now Central Parkway. This route divides downtown from over the Rhine, and it was the canal that gave Rhine to the name of that neighborhood. The German immigrants who settled on the north side of the canal in the early and middle 19th century hailed from the Rhineland, and they were predominantly Catholic. After I moved away from the city in 2005, over the Rhine, or OTR, gentrified at a meteoric rate. By the time of my 36th birthday, OTR's blocks upon blocks of Italianate architecture and its people of every age and color mixing together would come to seem the heart of the city of Seven Hills. So much entertainment and culture had moved to OTR by then that other neighborhoods, like Mount Adams, that Severine had loved, now felt obsolescent. But in the spring of 2001, Severine could still be in love with the idea of drinking wine in Mount Adams. And at that time, all anyone talked about in connection with OTR was the rioting that had occurred there 6 weeks before, when Cincinnati police officer Stephen Roach, a white man, shot and killed an unarmed 19-year-old Black man named Timothy Thomas. Okay. So that was one complete movement of my book. I should explain a couple of things now, I think. And if anyone wants to butt in with anything, please do. Always happy to field unexpected and strange questions. But about, first of all, quickly about the title of the book and the title of the suite that I just read from. It's called The Genius of Renunciation, the second suite of the novel. And of course, the novel is called Absolute Music. So what is going on with all that? As I said, McPhail is or was a music composition student, a musician, and absolute music is a technical term. It means music that has no referential verbal apparatus of any kind, which is quite a mouthful. It means that there's no language attached to the music that refers to anything outside of the music. So titles that are more than just technical descriptions of the music are out, and there's no words, of course, in the music, no lyrics, and certainly there's nothing in the way of what we call programmatic music, which was this wonderful genre of music, probably not much composed anymore, but it would be instrumental music, like gosh, I don't know, like Richard Strauss's Don Quixote, or Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead, or one of my very most favorite composers, Sibelius, wrote some amazing instrumental music, purely instrumental, but it would have titles that linked it to like Finnish. He was Finnish, Finnish mythology and history and stuff. So you can't have any of that, you know. You can't have a program that tells you what the music is about, as if the music could actually represent something, as if it could actually be representational, even though it's purely instrumental. So all that stuff's not absolute music. Absolute music is music that has no reference, no verbal reference to the world outside of the music. It's maybe what some people think of, first of all, in terms of classical music. MacPhail, part of the fiction of this thing is that MacPhail has actually written it, or at least the first draft of it, in music composition notebooks, as if this language is the absolute music that he once upon a time wished to but could not compose. And he's taken it as his model for it, what it might be some of the most famous and beloved absolute music, or pure music, in the Western canon, the 6 suites for solo cello composed by J.S. Bach in the early 18th century. And Bach also wrote 6 suites. Some of them are called sonatas, some of them are called partitas, but they're 6 suites for a solo violin. And actually, in the next part that I'm going to read from this novel, that music gets referenced. So MacPhail has taken that as one of the structuring principles, I guess, of this writing that he's doing. In the Bach suites, the internal movements of the music, that's why I refer to this as a movement that I just read. The movements do have names, and it goes in order of like prelude, allemande, courant, sarabande, a minuet of some kind, so like a bourrée, which means drunk, or a gavotte, and then a gigue at the end. I think I have that in the right order. And those are cool words, right? They're kind of cute. They sound like they are referential and meaningful, and they kind of are. They were actually names for dances, little aristocratic dances that people would do. My music history is too rough to remember if they were still actually dancing by Bach's time. My guess is not really, but it would just be sort of like a technical direction. Bourrée, dance like you're drunk, I guess. I don't know, but that's all it really meant. It didn't actually refer to anything specific in the outer world, the wider world. So those have names, but the actual suites themselves in Bach's cello suites don't have names. They just have technical descriptions, the key that they're in. The tonal system was sort of settling in at that point. So that's what absolute music is, and that's what this novel looks like. If you pick it up and look at it, the table of contents, you see suites, and the suites have titles, but the movements don't. They're just numbers. So it's kind of the opposite of how Bach's thing works. But I think that's the main thing I kind of wanted to explain, what's going on here structure-wise. That's one of the structuring principles of the book. Before I read any more, do you guys, should we talk about it at all? I kind of glanced and see there's some questions in there.
Jonathan, how would you like to handle that? Would you like to read them yourself and just go for it, or do you want me to mediate any of this for you?
Yeah, just let me just take a look at what people have written. If you'll excuse me for a moment. Okay, I'm gonna start with Jerry Stanek's. How much research did you do for the novel? How much information did you pull from memory? I don't know. I did a lot. I don't know if I thought of all of it as research. To the extent that I didn't research but tried to pull from memory stuff that I had studied sometimes many years ago. God knows how accurate I got it. So one of the things about the book is that, which you'll figure out if you read it, MacPhail, the narrator, is an extremely learned guy And Lord knows I've spent most of my life poring over books, but I think he's really more learned than I am. And that's actually, really, I mean, I'm trying to like present him that way. And that's actually a really challenging thing to do, because you kind of have to know just enough to make it seem like the narrator knows vastly more. I've certainly poked my nose in a dozen languages or more, and I can kind of mess around productively with like a half dozen of them. But yeah, the way MacPhail uses language and stuff is in some instances alludes to a capacity that is probably beyond mine. So I mean, that's not exactly an answer to Jerry's question, but it's kind of a funny thing about this book, I think, that that I noticed while writing it and rereading it, that this narrator of mine is actually maybe kind of out of my league intellectually. So the sources of the names, and why some characters don't get named. Well, so actually for some of that, I would just say read the book. MacPhail goes on a long riff. I mean, that's practically, it's his favorite thing to do, is to go on long riffs about what the name MacPhail means and where it comes from. Q is his wife. That's part of the info I need to explain for the next part I'm going to read. So I'm glad her name comes up. Q is his present wife, his second wife, his wife at the time of the narration, and at the time of the main storyline, which is from 2017 to 2018, which now feels like an insanely long time ago, like another world, even though I wrote the first sentence of this novel less than 5 years ago, and it feels like a completely different universe. But anyway, Q's name, his wife's name, is actually an acronym that she like styled herself with, apparently in her youth, when she met him. And MacPhail at one point says that it would be the same three letters, whether she used her maiden surname or his own. Severine as a name comes from, that is the feminine form of the name that is Soren Kierkegaard's name. Well, the Soren part, Soren, and yeah, there's a whole huge backstory to that I don't even want to get into, but I have weird ways of coming up with names. Some of them don't get named, and there's various reasons for that too. Partly it's because within the fiction, this is MacPhail writing about, like real people to him. So he's gonna maybe withhold names of certain people closest to him, his parents, his children, his wife, considering that's her acronym, or initials, maybe some others. The naming is kind of, yeah, it's all over the place. I'll just say naming is a theme in the book. It has some metaphysical scope to it, as you would, I hope, gather if you read it. Who gets a name, what kind of names they get. In the third suite at the end, there's quite a bit about the surnames of Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. The writer Joseph Roth, in fact, gets quoted on that subject. So yeah, names are a complex and weighty theme in the whole thing. I did just speak about music and movements, Dunya, I hope to your satisfaction. But if there's any more questions in that vein, please let me know. Is MacPhail obsessed with information throughout, like he is in this excerpt, as a central aspect of his character? If so, what do you see as the role of information in the novel's literary effect? Yeah, fantastic question. I think it's on the jacket copy, but at some point late in the novel, MacPhail refers to his consciousness as obsolete. And That means a lot of things, I hope. But one of the things it means is that, as I was saying earlier, he's this hyper-learned guy, and he has grave doubts about the value and ongoing legitimacy of that learning, or relevance, I guess you could say. He's definitely obsessed with information. I myself personally have, I'm kind of ambivalent about that in terms of literary effect. I have, especially as I've been teaching nonfiction in recent semesters, I have become very fascinated by knowledge in literature. And this novel, it does to some extent push the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction, not in the sense of its veracity, but in its essayistic quality, its digressive, informational quality. Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by that, to the various different ways that writing, particularly for what I tend to teach and what I'm interested in working on now, nature writing or anything involving the environment, the degree to which that depends upon and the different ways in which it deploys information, knowledge, observational acumen. So it's possible that MacPhail, the narrator, was partly an effort on my part to explore both the benefits and pitfalls of having a lot of information at your disposal, trying to rely on that to a great extent, and where it doesn't get you, because as great as knowledge of many kinds can be, it can also be a bit of a lure. It can be a bit of a distraction from what is essential or what's really going on. And it can be a source of hubris. You can think that you understand much more than you really do. So I would certainly say that that's a huge issue for the narrator of this novel. Was I trying to make MacPhail likable? Oh, sorry, I just skipped over Hank's question. I was trying to make him, so okay, I have a quote that I'm actually, it's not even a quote, it's a mangled paraphrase, but this wonderful 20th century expositor of Zen and East Asian thought and culture, a man who lived most of his life there, R.H. Blythe, much of whose work Angelico has just brought back into print. He has this great line in his still out of print 5-volume Zen and Zen Classics, where he says, basically, good and evil have to be in perfect balance, and good has to just barely win. Like I say, I'm mangling that, but Blythe is very eloquent. But that is kind of my attitude towards the sympathetic or not quality of MacPhail. I wanted to make him, the likable and unlikable aspects of him, in perfect balance, with just the likable or sympathetic qualities just barely winning in the end. Of course, I won't necessarily have done that for every reader, but that was sort of what I was going for. He's not, I didn't think of him in terms of like hero and anti-hero. That sounds too extreme to me. He's more of a real person than that. Wonderful historical context. What does history do to reinforce a fictional universe? Does it have aesthetic significance? That's the question I skipped. History. This actually goes, I actually almost, if I had the time, I would want to tie this to the Christina's question about enchantment, because and Tolkien, because history, the sense of deep history in places, is of enormous interest to me personally. And I think that it's an extremely important aspect of a variety of different literary genres, or just a lot of different literary works. Definitely in Tolkien, to again look forward to Christina's question there. So much of the feeling of Tolkien's world, at any point in it, even the now earlier stages of it, which are being turned into a TV show by Amazon, I think. I know nothing about that kind of stuff. But anyway, any point in Tolkien's world is full of like deep history. There's always this sense that whatever is happening at that time in the story, there's a ton of other stuff that happened before that's extremely important. That's fantasy, although Tolkien always tied his fantasy to the real earth, which is extremely important. But I think that kind of sense of the depth of history, which is a sense that kind of goes beyond good and evil. I mean, it includes them both, but goes beyond, is yeah, I just think it's important to a great deal of writing. It's certainly not confined to fantasy, although it ought to be emphasized actually as particularly important to fantasy. If you read the novel and you get to know this MacPhail guy, this fantasist dude, you'll eventually get to learn about the fantasy that he's trying to write, and you'll learn that it's alternative history of a kind. So that might actually speak more to the question about history than I can at the moment. But it is almost like its own aesthetic, its own raga in Sanskrit. Like it's got like the sense of history being there is its own presence, and it can be good, it can be bad. I mean, it's virtually always in every particular mixed. The passage that I just read starts out with this like legendary mythical history type thing, Romulus and Remus, and with some reference to Cain and Abel, and there's a lot of violence, and eventually you get through the Revolutionary War and colonial history, which is more what we think of as like real history, and then ends with the 2001 violence in over the Rhine, which has to do with, you know, the racial history of the United States. So the passage I just read tries to bring in several different kinds of history, I guess you could say. Yeah, so the clock is ticking on. So I think if I can read another passage, I will. And then another round of the question. Like I said, the third suite, which I'll now read from, page 104, for those of you following along at home with your own copies. The fifth movement of it, the third suite's called Rosenzweig in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh is another really important place in this novel. You know, motivations for writing a book are impossible to really state all the way, but two of them for me are, first of all, to create a certain kind of prose. I think Eugene Vodolazkin, the amazing Ukrainian Russian writer, one of the best novelists that I've read, who's currently alive, has this line somewhere about, someone asked him the common question for writers, like, where do your ideas come from? And he basically says that nowhere, I don't have any. I get into the language of a narrator, and then I get going with that, and that's my novel. And I understand that completely, because you get into a particular feeling for the language and a rhythm with the language, and you're writing almost just so you can work with the English language, in my case, in that way. It's a kind of way of thinking about writing that we usually hear from poets about, but I cut my teeth on poetry, and I think poetry is, I think all prose writers should, and that's often how I think of poetry. I don't even care what I'm writing. I just want to be producing sentences of a particular kind. I think I've got Annie Dillard on my side for that too. But anyway, that's one motivation. But another big one for a novel like this is place. And so there was certain places that I wanted to represent, to do justice somehow or honor somehow in writing, in fiction. But of course, in saying that, I'm pointing towards where fiction and reality coincide, because the places are real. Everything else about the book is fictionalized to at least some degree, and many parts of it to a very high degree. But the places and the weather even are very real. They're accurate in that sense. This kind of points back to Luke's question about, I think it was Luke, about information. Accuracy and knowledge is related to that. And the places are depicted, I hope, not just realistically, but accurately. So Pittsburgh was one of the ones that I wanted to do that way. The only thing I'll tell you about this last part that I'll read from is that there's a character I mentioned, an old friend of the narrator, Joel Stein, who becomes important later on in the novel. I've already told you Q is his wife at the time of his writing. He had lost a job earlier in the novel. He loses a job through his own ridiculousness at a kind of Catholic prep school type thing. And also the novel opens with MacPhail's investigation of the writer Michael Ende, a German writer, famous for writing the novel, famous in our language, that we know as The Neverending Story, which you're going to hear the name of that in here, Die unendliche Geschichte. MacPhail reads the actual book in the earlier part of this novel, the actual book, The Neverending Story, and which is extremely different from the movie. So even if you never touch my novel and never think about this again, you should, if you have any interest in The Neverending Story, the movie that probably we've all seen, you should go out and somehow get your hands on a copy of the actual novel that's based off of, because it'll blow your mind how utterly unlike the film it is. Extremely hard to get a hold of. At least it was back when I was writing this thing. Maybe it's changed now. Anyway, we're going back in time 1 year, not even, to the year 2000 in this passage. Fifth movement from the third suite. There is a long hallway in a house. The walls of the house are brick outside and in, and the hallway is dark. Yes, very dark, because the bricks are not the cream of Milwaukee brick or the crimson of Cincinnati brick or even the ruddy brick of Chicago. The house is in Pittsburgh and the bricks are dark as dried blood. The ceiling is low and the walls are close in the part of the hallway where I have just entered it, toward the back of the house, where the hallway terminates or originates at the entrance to the master bedroom, and at a slightly higher level accessed by 3 stairs leading to a very short passage, 2 other bedrooms, and a bathroom. I have come out of one of these bedrooms. In about the middle of its course, the hallway down which I walk becomes wider and the ceiling higher, no longer perpetually darkened, but illuminated on this day by a low gray sky that refracts a chilly light through the house's rectangular clerestory windows. At this juncture in the hallway, where one passes from dark to light or from light to dark, there is a vestibule off to one side, which gives onto a bathroom and a 4th bedroom. The house belongs to my father's parents. The bedroom just mentioned was used for some time by my father's paternal grandfather, Meyer, until he died in 1981, a month before I was born, and then by my father's maternal grandmother, Rokel, until she died in 1991. In fact, she died on Christmas night, having lived just long enough to see the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the last events she witnessed in this life, on a TV in that bedroom, was Mikhail Gorbachev's resignation and the lowering of the Soviet flag from the Kremlin for the last time. According to my father, she then spoke something in Yiddish he couldn't quite understand and died. But the time I'm writing about is the noon hour of Thanksgiving in the year 2000, and the 4th bedroom is occupied by Severine. I'm walking down the hallway, having put aside my studies. A textbook on Baroque music lies open, and next to it a composition notebook, the same kind in which I first drafted these suites, on which I had been sketching music for keyboard that I would not myself be able to play very well. What is evident to me now is that the music I was in the midst of setting down could easily have been made into a duet for violin and cello. But at the time of which I'm writing, my mind was capable only of abstraction, and I could not imagine real players making real music from the notes that I wrote down. And so I was unable to compose music for Severine and me to play together, nor indeed for anyone to play. At the moment I'm writing of, I'm driven by hunger to go to the kitchen where my father's sister and my mother are preparing the large meal. I've decided to purloin several small pastries commonly available in Pittsburgh and known as thumbprints, for the indentation made by the thumb in the small round dough filled with frosting. The hallway is carpeted, so I make no noise as I go, but the hallway is not silent. Shortly after I begin walking down the hallway, my progress is arrested by the sight of my grandparents in the vestibule adjoining Severine's room. They are very still, hunched and tilting forward so that my grandfather Isaac can press his right ear and my grandmother Miriam her left ear to the door behind which Severine is playing her violin. I am able to make out that Severine is playing the saraband from Bach's first partita for solo violin. My grandparents are 85 years old at this time and hard of hearing, yet it seems to me that this is not the only reason they've drawn as close as they can get to Severine's music without disturbing her. She's in her senior year of high school, preparing, despite her stated intention to remain by me in Cincinnati, for auditions at several conservatories, and therefore nervous. She will gain admittance anywhere she applies, but neither her teacher nor I can convince her of this, and she's always anxious and insists on practicing even throughout most of Thanksgiving Day. My grandparents have never before heard Severine play. They met her for the first time the previous night when we arrived from Cincinnati. I say nothing as I walk past them. As I go by, a remarkable event occurs in my mind. It is as if, hearing her music, I am able for 1 or 2 seconds to see Severine. Not only do I see her through the door and the dark brick wall, as it were, but at the same time, or right afterwards, I see her from outside the house. One wall of the bedroom where Severine is staying communicates with a small greenhouse, which can also be entered from the yard. The greenhouse contains various cultivars of geranium, which my grandmother has kept there since her mother Rokel spent her final years in the bedroom that Severine is now using. As I am passing my grandparents listening to Severine, as I move from the dark and narrow part of the hallway into the broad and luminous part, I seem to see Severine from outside the house, as though I were looking in through the greenhouse full of red geraniums. I see Severine wearing a carnelian sweater and playing her fox red violin. This warm image has the feel of reality or truth, something that I see with my bodily eyes. It has that feeling when it appears to me in the hallway of my grandparents' house, as I recall it in a basement in Michigan in the spring of 2018, and even now as I write. At the time when I'm walking down the hallway of my grandparents' house in Pittsburgh to fetch some thumbprints on Thanksgiving in the year 2000, I have never seen Severine practicing music in a geranium room, as we called it, either from outside the house or from within. Of the uncounted memories, the horde of images of the past that seem to make up the bedrock of my mind, only this one seems to consist of both real and unreal elements. Or to put it another way, the image is composed of 2 perspectives, perhaps something like contrapuntal music. A perspective implies one who perceives. So these 2 perspectives, if they are both mine, must be mutually exclusive, for I cannot be in 2 places at once. One of these perspectives was real, the perspective from where I actually stood. The other is merely realistic in the sense that if I had walked outside to see Severine playing the saraband from the first partita that Bach wrote for solo violin, what I would have seen would have accorded with the image that presented itself to my mind. But surely this is not taking the matter far enough. In fact, both perspectives were purely potential, or you could say fantasy. I did not, in fact, see Severine at all. If the door had been open and my grandparents not in the way, or if I had X-ray vision and could look through a brick wall, then the image of Severine as seen from the hallway would also have been realistic. I am now in the situation of calling 2 totally fantastical or potential scenarios realistic. What kind of sense can this make? I've come to see this compound image, this 2-part fantasy, as a glimpse of the unreality that exists at the heart of reality, the world behind the world. And it is important that one part of the image was the perspective that would have been mine in the world of actuality, had not the wall of my grandparents intervened. I had come to think that fantastical images of this kind, rooted in and departing from a real position, composed the bedrock of my mind. If Joel were to read this piece of writing, he might invoke the categories of actuality and potentiality. He would describe this pair as one of the polarities of being. Everything that can be said to exist falls under one of these categories, potentiality or actuality. Potentiality is not non-being, since non-being is not a category. Fiction, Joel would likely say, enjoys the kind of being called potentiality. And he would add that traditionally potentiality has been understood as the inferior of the two kinds of being. Perhaps he would add that on Thanksgiving Day in Pittsburgh in the year 2000, I beheld a vision of Severine transfigured into fiction, indeed a doubled vision. Nor could it have been otherwise. The world of actuality is the world of the singular. The world of potentiality is the world of the many, the infinitely receding horizon. When I wrote the phrase bedrock of my mind, I made use of a metaphor so common as almost to have become what is known as a dead metaphor. However, I used this particular expression in a personal, or you could say a living way. For a long time, I've thought of my mind as a landscape. Contrary to the headmaster's complaint, and no matter where I really am in the wide world, some part of me stands in a very certain place, a place of four seasons, where hardwood trees flourish upon limestone and clay in a terrain described by the incontrovertible logic of water running in ever greater courses to one almighty river. Since I was a child, I have wondered that the waters of this place, which is the place of my mind as well as the place where I was raised in the wide world, can flow only ever with one tendency, whereas a human person has the potential to go against the intention of the waters. As a child, I wondered only at the flow of waters in the wide world. But in the springtime of 2018, sitting in a basement in Michigan and surrounded by large-scale topographical maps of the terrain in the wide world where I was raised, I wondered at the mind's capacity to go against the tendency of its own waters. The bedrock of the middle and upper parts of the Ohio Valley consists in many places of limestone or other rock that contain many fossils. As a boy, I spent a lot of time wandering our local creeks with Gregory and examining the fossils exposed there in the beds. We collected the more elaborate and arcane specimens that caught our eye, if we could carry away the rocks that housed them. Sometimes we would chip away at a piece of limestone rubble that was too large for us to carry so that we could take the part containing the fossil home. And sometimes this effort ended in our destroying the fossil. I would notice when we visited my father's parents in Pittsburgh that many strata of such rock visible in the cutaways made by the interstate. I came to think of the ground I habitually stood and walked and ran upon as containing innumerable images, frozen memories in the mind of the earth of her ancient days. This conception of the earth as a bedrock of memory persisted and grew until now it figured my own mind. When I read in Die unendliche Geschichte of Bastian unearthing the frail and glassy image that would allow him to return to the world of what was for him actuality, as Joel Stein would explain it, the world of Bastian's father and his dead mother, I was unnerved in the way that Bastian was unnerved, perhaps horrified, while reading a book that seemed to have been written about him. When I think of how on a certain cold and gray day in Pittsburgh, at the turn of the century, I saw Severine practicing, and at the same time I did not see her. And when I think of how writers of various kinds have struggled to understand and say something about what is not, or what is not there, or what is no longer, I also think of a poem by Friedrich Hölderlin that I read closely on the occasion of my last visit to Pittsburgh before I remembered Hannah under the locusts and began composing these suites. In November of 2015, almost exactly 15 years after Severine played Bach's first partito for solo violin in my grandparents' house, my grandparents leaned into the door to listen and closed their eyes and trembled with great age and also with a feeling that I cannot name and perhaps do not know. The occasion of this last trip to Pittsburgh was the wedding of one of Q's friends from college. I had not at that time been to the city in over 10 years. Q had suffered her first miscarriage 6 months previously. To cope with this lingering sorrow, I had decided to translate some poetry, and Hölderlin was my choice. During the time Q drove on the way to Pittsburgh from Chicago, I read Hölderlin's poem Heidelberg aloud. Q understands spoken German much better than spoken French. I had been struggling to translate this poem to my satisfaction. I explained the problem to Q, and she guessed that while I grasped the emotion that the poet had embodied in the poem and recognized it as one that I too had felt, the emotion had become dead to me, she said, a sort of fossilized artifact. The difficulty persisted until the day after the wedding, when we were at our leisure to roam Pittsburgh for a time before heading back to Chicago. I had decided to show Q a few of the sights that had once been dear and familiar to me. For breakfast, I took Q to a cafe called Beehive on Carson Street, the main drag in a neighborhood called the Southside Flats. This was one of two cafes in Pittsburgh where between the mid-1990s and 2004, I habitually loitered and drank coffee and smoked and talked with my friend Joel Stein, the other being Ritter's on Baum Boulevard, already mentioned. Q and I had had a wet and unusually warm journey to Pittsburgh, but the murk blew away during the wedding and was replaced by cooler, dry air and stark sunlight that pierced the city down to the last turning oak leaf and blown detritus. When we'd finished breakfast in one of the cozy alcoves girded by bay windows and protruding into Carson Street from the Beehive, the very table where Severine had once told Joel Stein, "You'll never be a writer. You like the idea of writing more than writing," I walked us out over the nearby 10th Street Bridge. On the other side, the right bank of the Monongahela, Duquesne University sits up on the hill, but I just wanted the perspective from the middle of the bridge, one of the most glorious superfluvial views in the city. And there in the crystalline day, poised over the water that would reach the city of Seven Hills after flowing 450 curving miles, I understood Hölderlin's poem as another instance of the kind of beguiling fantasy I had had in my grandparents' home on Thanksgiving Day in 2000. Or for that matter, the vertiginous fantasy of Cincinnati that I saw from the steps below the Immaculata with Gregory on Good Friday in 1989. In particular, I understood the third verse of the German poem, for I could now see why the poet had chosen the word schien, past tense of scheinen, that the pathos of the poem, which had previously been dead to me, was ensconced in this one common word. The poet is speaking in the third stanza of a time he walked over a bridge in Heidelberg, which city he has called Ländlichschönste of all the cities known to him, fullest with a country beauty, as I would go on to translate it. In the third stanza, the poet says he was transfixed on the bridge as if by gods. Hölderlin is always talking about the gods. They are for him the sense of the realness of reality, guarantors of the depths and richness of being, which is something from which he most often feels himself exiled. This is a difficult idea, but even more difficult for me was the second part of the third stanza. Und rein in die Berge, mir die reizende Ferne schien. What makes the sense so hard to grasp, I realized standing on the 10th Street Bridge, is that scheinen means both to shine and to appear or to seem. The word is in fact very like the Greek root of fantasy, with its paradoxical double sense of radiance and illusion. What the poet says in these lines could be described as a fusion of immanence and transcendence. Something from afar comes innermost to the poet, and he in turn is carried without leaving the spot beyond his ken. Right here, to me, so it seemed, into the hills the distance shone. We were looking downstream. The spires of downtown loomed ahead and to our right. To our left, the golden dome of St. John the Baptist Ukrainian Catholic Church glared from the level of Carson Street, the south side slopes rising behind it. I picked out for Q from the palimpsest of spans and pylons, the Liberty Bridge, the Panhandle Bridge, the Smithfield Street Bridge, and farthest among those we could see, the Fort Pitt Bridge. I explained what I had realized to Q, and she said, I don't think we ever get free of it, that double fantasy. Okay. Quite enough, I think, right? It's a lot of MacPhail. That was kind of the, well, I don't know, maybe one of the philosophical hearts of the novel. And as some of you may know, I'm a little bit obsessed, or I was when I was writing this novel, with the contemporary, but now elderly Australian novelist, Gerald Murnane, who, for my money, is maybe the most metaphysically sophisticated novelist out there, but he would never describe himself in that way. And that particular movement of the third suite, which is the only suite that has an actual philosopher in its title, I guess, is maybe kind of philosophical, metaphysical heart of the book, or a key to it. And it's definitely an imitation of some of Murnane's writing, a slight imitation. It's not a slavish imitation, but I don't know if we have time for any more questions, or if anyone wants to throw in anything else. I'm actually now up past 9 minutes past my bedtime. I usually sleep like an hour after my kids are asleep. So my cogency may be diminishing rapidly, but
Jonathan, we've got one final question from Luke that is down there at the bottom. Do you want to take a quick look at that?
McPhail uses the term fantasy, but based on his passion, I wonder if the term imagination might be appropriate. Do I distinguish between the two? Matter of degree. Oh man, for the answer to that, I refer you to the collected works of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He uses fantasy because it's in Dante. Again, so is imagination, or versions of that. It's an ancient. It has a fascinating pedigree, I guess, or history. It starts out its life as an almost entirely negative thing, a pejorative thing, a hallucination brought on by the devil, basically. And then, at least to my knowledge, and McPhail talks about this, it gets transmogrified by Dante. And now it has become a twofold term. And someone else asked earlier if I would talk about this. I can't really at sufficient length or coherently enough right now, but I mean, there's good fantasy and bad fantasy now. And that complexity, that ambivalence, to me, makes fantasy a more interesting term than imagination, which is kind of more univocal in my understanding. It's just kind of always good, but in a somewhat, I feel like now, worn down way. Fantasy still has some mystique to it. I think because it's got that bivalence. It's a long history, and the etymology of it, as a McPhail kind of goes into there, and what I just read is also kind of more interesting to me than imagination. Imagination is a fascinating word too, though, and especially in the Christian, well, actually Jewish too, because this is translating the Old Testament, but the idea of imago Dei, the image of God, was right there in the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, that's a crucial word, although really we should get into some Hebrew stuff to talk about that. But yeah, I get a lot of mileage out of fantasy. It's interesting how both imagination and fantasy furnish descriptors for literary categories, but imagination furnishes the much larger category. We refer to imaginative literature to distinguish it from, more informational, to go back to your early question, Luke, informational writing that in which the language itself is not so important. We're just trying to get some knowledge, some information. So we talk about imaginative literature, and it's kind of a synonym for creative writing. So yeah, I teach creative writing. I make my students read imaginative literature in order, as part of that. Whereas fantasy now, really quite recently, in larger historical terms, also is a literary genre, but it's much more specific than this huge sweeping thing, imaginative literature. It goes back to another question someone asked, Christina, I think, about Tolkien and fantasy and enchantment. It now refers to a kind of literature that actually the definition of it is quite contentious, and people have different ideas. Mine are very geographical, but yeah, it's just interesting that both those terms have to do with how we categorize and talk about literature. Yeah, phantasm. That's a good one to bring into something otherworldly, supernatural, metaphysical about fantasy. Yeah, it's got an aura to it. It can even be creepy. It can be tragic and destructive too. To get lost in your fantasies, to be deluded, basically. And imagination just doesn't. There's not like a version of that word that has that same gravity, same interest. What do I read to my children? Well, we're trying to read Narnia for the first time now. The Narnia books. We're in Prince Caspian. Of course, we all maybe disagree about what order to read the Narnia books in, but my older son is reasonably interested, pretty well able to follow along with the Narnia books for the first time. So that's kind of cool for me. I was much older than him actually when I first read Narnia, so any of them. So and I have I actually just took out from the library a book I haven't even read yet, but I'm really eager to, by a Swedish author. I've never read anything by her, and I'm going to butcher her name, but it's Selma Lagerlöf or something like that. Lagerlöf, for all I know how to say that. It's Lagerlo with an umlaut F. And she wrote something called like the Christ Legends, but also she has these stories of a kid named Niels that look really cool to me. They're kind of Narnia-like. The Scandinavians write amazing children's stuff. There's also Tove Jansson with the Moomin Trolls. And I just bought a wonderful illustrated Hobbit that I hope to read to the older son, at least pretty soon. But yeah, as I say, as my wife is commenting there, the Narnia does seem to be making an impression already. And even though our 3-year-old doesn't seem like he's ever paying attention to the stories, he'll come out with some reference to Narnia. Like we were in the backyard of the woods the other day, and he's talked about a lamppost in the woods. And I was like, oh, so you were listening to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Didn't think you picked up on that. Yeah, I hope to start him out with fantasy early. I first read, or actually listened to The Hobbit when I was about 7 years old on this amazing 1979 radio drama production of it that I have the cassettes I listened to as a kid somewhere in my house. So it's like a radio drama with actual different actors, and some sound effects. It's insanely good. And it is most of the book, although there are some passages that were not recorded, including one that refers to fairyland, which I discovered on my last rereading of The Hobbit. But that was like kind of the beginning of my life as a literary person. And so hopefully within the next year or two, you will maybe get to that level for my kids. Yeah, everyone's
Jonathan,
going to bed, so I should too.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Congratulations again on the publication of the book. I've put links in the chat for going to the page on the Slant's website where you can click on multiple options for where you want to get the book, from the huge giants that we tend to love and hate at the same time to more indie options. Hopefully you'll find one that suits you. Absolute Music is available in cloth-bound, paperback, and ebook editions now. A few final notes. First, we hope you keep an eye out for announcements of our next online book launch event, which will take place in early September, when we feature the hybrid volume of poems and memoir by Robert Cording, In the Unwalled City. In the Unwalled City takes its title from Epicurus, who wrote, "Against other things it is possible to obtain security, but when it comes to death, we human beings all live in an unwalled city." This affecting book, which weaves prose memoir with poetry, explores that feeling of being open to attack, in this case, the pain of grief after Robert Cording's 31-year-old son, Daniel, died. To borrow a phrase from C.S. Lewis, here is a grief observed, encompassing not only the big questions, but also the impact of grief on daily life. For a poet like Cording, one form that grief takes is that of speaking to his son. In Afterlife, Cording has a vision of his son replying, "Let the emptiness remain empty. Stop writing down everything you think I'm telling you. This is your afterlife, not mine." At the heart of In the Unwalled City is a series of questions. How does loss change a person? How does one chart a new life that both acknowledges a son's death and still finds a way back to delight? How does one now live fully in an unwalled city? To keep up with news about new and forthcoming titles from Slant, please visit our website and sign up for our monthly e-newsletter, Slantwise. And don't forget the twice-weekly posts at our blog, Close Reading. Tonight's event has been recorded and will be available on the book's webpage and on Slant's YouTube channel. It will also be available as part of our new podcast, which is, you guessed it, SlantCast. Please note that episodes of SlantCast will include our online book launch events, but will also feature exclusive audio-only content on a variety of literary topics. By early September, it will be possible to subscribe to SlantCast via all the major podcast outlets. Finally, I'd ask you to bear in mind that Slant is a nonprofit press. Your tax-deductible donations make possible the kind of intensive editing and exquisite production values that uphold the highest literary standards and ensure that quality books that might not otherwise be available or accessible are given the treatment they deserve. To support our work, just go to slantbooks.org and click on Donate. And everybody, remember to tell the truth, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Thanks again, and see you next time.